just had a bird shot down. Somewhere to the north of us, we're going out and secure the bird and pick up the crew.
Do you know how bad the bird is hit?
Negative. We won't be able to tell when we get down to the ground.
The nurse come out of the delivery room and said, "Who does Sergeant McKiddy belong to?" And I said, "Me." And then after that, here come another nurse out, and she said, "Mr. McKiddy?" I said, "Yes. Congratulations, you've got a girl." And I said, "Oh my God, have I got twins?" So then, here come another nurse out, you know. She said, "Congratulations, you got a son," you know. And they looked at each other and went back in, they come back, and what they were doing is getting April's food on me because it was April Fool's Day. Of course, that was the pride and joy of our life, having our first kid. But he's just a ordinary kid, you know. Didn't do nothing, no more or no less than anybody else, you know. Of course, Gary, he went into service during the Vietnam War in '69. It was kind of a shock to me when he went in because I didn't even know he was thinking about going in. So he volunteered for the draft. Took his basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey. And after his basic training, they sent him to Fort Lewis, Washington for advanced infantry training. So when Gary got to Vietnam, the first thing he did was volunteer for the 1st Cav Division. And they made a company clerk out of him because he knew how to type. And he wrote me a letter one time. He said, "Well, Dad," he says, I'm getting tired of the major hollered at me about shining my shoes, get a haircut." And he says, I'm going to go into something else. I'm going to get out of the orderly room." So they needed observers for Loach helicopters for scout duty. So he volunteered and went out one day with them on scout duty. And he came back, he told his friend, he said, "Ain't no way they're going to keep me off the ground, on the ground now. I like that flying, I'm going to stay with it." So he volunteered for scouts. And I think that they said that he had flew something like 625 missions. And he met Jim Skaggs while he was there. And they got to be pretty good friends, real close friends.
The story I want to share with you is sometimes it's a difficult story to share. Sometimes it's more difficult than others. And so I never know exactly how I'm going to emotionally respond as I share this story because I have to relive it to share it. I learned a number of years ago that it was probably healthier for me to share the story than to stuff it inside. That I believe that Gary McKiddy needs to be honored and his family needs to be honored for what happened. And if I don't tell the story, then that doesn't happen. I was 19 years old when I joined the Army in January of 1969. And I joined the Army in the height of the Vietnam War. There was 3 reasons. I didn't want to be drafted, I wanted to get a good school, and I didn't want to go to Vietnam. So I joined, I wasn't drafted, and 7 months later I arrived in Vietnam. And my entire graduating class went to Vietnam in August of 1969. They all went to the air traffic control tower, and I was taken out of my graduating class. Somehow I was the lucky winner who was assigned to a combat unit as a radio, telephone, switchboard operator in an operations center. That was with the 1st Cavalry Division, 1st of the 9th. And what I did was I kept track of helicopter sorties all day long. We had 3 types of helicopters that we flew with the 1st of the 9th. One was the Huey, which was a troop transport, basically, a helicopter. And then we also flew the Cobra helicopter, which was the attack helicopter. And then we also flew what was called the Loach, the LOH, Light Observation Helicopter. We had the pilot flew in the right seat, and we would put an enlisted man as the co-pilot in the left seat alongside the pilot, and he would receive basic training on how to fly that helicopter in case the pilot were injured. And then we had a crew chief door gunner in the back seat of the helicopter. And so that's what we did was, in the operations center, I kept track of these helicopter units as they went out. The light and observation helicopter would go out at treetop level, scout out enemy territory, and they were actually called scouts. The Cobra would fly escort up around 500 to 1,000 feet and just keeping guard over the scout as he was flying down a treetop. Then if there was any trouble of any sort, we would maybe bring Hueys out to drop infantry troops at the site of some sort of conflict. What happened was I was doing this for maybe 2 months. I was in Vietnam, working in the operations center, getting to meet all the pilots, and what I began doing just for the fun of it, I had 2 days off during the week, and what I would do then is I began to volunteer to fly scouts, left front seat co-pilot, because I like to fly. I'd been in Vietnam for 2 months when one day I was sitting on my bunk and I'm playing a guitar, and in walks this young fella with a big smile on his face and throws out his hand and says, "Hey, my name's Gary McKiddy." He says, "I play the guitar too." And so Gary and I became good friends. And when Gary would fly, what happened was he was assigned to scouts as the guy who sat in the back seat, the door gunner crew chief. And when he would go out on a mission and I was off on that day, I always made sure that I flew with him. The first time I ever saw a picture of Mr. McKiddy was he was wearing a long hair, it was a black wig, and flashing the peace sign. And we both just laughed and laughed about that. It was this, I couldn't believe that was really his dad when I saw that. And I said, "That's really your dad?" He said, "Yeah, he's got a wig on." I said, "Oh, okay." And it made sense. Gary and I flew together off and on for a long time. And we were involved in a lot of dangerous situations. And there were a number of times that we both had a day off on the same day. And one time, our infantry unit, which was called the Blues, they were going out on a one-day patrol. And Gary and I were off that day, and we thought, let's just do something different. Let's volunteer to go with the Blues and walk through the jungle, hack our way through the jungle with these infantrymen and see what that's like. I remember we walked into this village, and when we got there, all these little kids were swarming around, and that made me nervous. And I remember what Gary did. He laid his M16 automatic rifle down on the ground, and he got down on his knees. And when he did, all these little kids swarmed over him. And he began rolling around on the ground with them and laughing and tickling them. And I just thought, this is just crazy. But that's just the kind of person he was. And he wasn't uptight about it at all. And he just had a great time. And he opened up all of his sea rations and took all the candy, anything he had that he could give them, and he gave it to them. And I thought, this is an amazing person. When I met Gary and we began doing these missions together, he never talked about being afraid. And I would see him out at these little remote fire bases. We would take lunch or take a break or something, and I'd see him pull out a New Testament Bible out of his flight jacket, out of his pocket, and I'd see him reading that every once in a while. But he never said anything to me about it. And Gary never related to me that he was fearful in any way about what we were doing and about our missions. We were told that we had about a 30-day life expectancy as scout crewmen. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's what we were told. We did have a lot of crews go down. We lost a lot of young men. And so definitely it was a dangerous job.
How did that make you feel? You were there on a mission and you were told you're going to live 30 more days.
Well, I don't know. Young men, as a young man, 20-year-old boys, we tended to believe that it wouldn't happen to us. That, you're at that age where you just think you're invulnerable, and you've got a high-powered rifle in your hands to back it up. And so you just felt like it wouldn't happen to you. it might happen to another guy, even though you knew that it could, you just felt like it wouldn't somehow. And so I never heard Gary say that he was afraid, and I never told him I was afraid. We actually joked about the possibility of dying, and that's the way everybody was who was in these helicopter crews. We were scheduled, the 1st Cavalry Division was going to invade Cambodia. Well, the war was being escalated by President Nixon at that time, and we were going to escalate the war, and we were going to invade Cambodia. And so we were scheduled to go in. Our particular crew was scheduled to go in on May the 6th, 1970. And May the 5th, that evening, I pulled guard duty, and I checked by Gary's bunk just to see how he was doing. About 9 o'clock that night, I got off guard duty, and I stopped by his bunk, checked on him, see how he was doing, and he was nervous. I'd never seen him like this before. He was acting a little differently than I'd ever seen him act before. And he said this to me, he says, "Jim, I don't want you to go tomorrow. I want you to, I'm going to scratch your name off the mission list. I don't want you to go." And I didn't understand that. And I told him, I said, if you're going, I'm going, and that's just the way it is. And then he said this, I remember this exactly, he said, "I'm going to stay up all night and pray." Now, I don't know if he meant he was actually going to stay up all night and pray, but he did say that. And he said, "I'd like for you to join me." And to this day, I regret the fact that I told my best friend, "No, I'm not interested in that. You go ahead and pray for us." Next morning, we got up early. We always took off before sunup. We got breakfast and took off before sunup. Mr. Whitten, who would have been in Vietnam, I believe, about 2 months at that time. We'd phoned with him several times, but being new, he was fairly inexperienced. At this point, I'd been in Vietnam 9 months, and also at this point, I had switched completely over to Scouts. I was no longer working in the operations center. I volunteered to fly Scouts. I had a Cobra helicopter to fly escort for us, and we took off and we headed north into Cambodia. Just these 2 helicopters to assign to this village that we were going to check out. We flew across the river border into Cambodia and with a full tank of fuel, and flew to this village. And as we approached this village, sun was coming up. And as we're approaching the village, we noticed some civilians leaving the village. And when we arrived over the village, we noticed some large warehouse-type buildings that we weren't accustomed to seeing in Vietnam. We also saw foxholes and camouflage clothing hanging out to dry. And what we had stumbled into was some sort of an enemy stronghold. We didn't know exactly what, but there was a large staging area there and supply area for North Vietnamese troops to cross over from Cambodia into South Vietnam. And so as we circled the village at treetop level, we came over this one hut, and when we did, an enemy soldier jumped out of this hut. We actually woke him up, and he jumped out of this hut into the foxhole. And Gary asked Mr. Whitten, do you want me to shoot him? Because that's what we did. And he was unarmed, and so Mr. Whitten said, "No, he's unarmed, let's not bother him." So we circled back around, and we came back around, and when we did, this same hut that we had been over, this enemy soldier was gone. He was no longer in the foxhole. So we had a little box of white phosphorus grenades that we carried. Gary had them back there in the back with him, and a little box of fragmentation grenades, maybe about 4 grenades in each box. Mr. Whitten says, "Take a white phosphorus and drop it on the hut. Let's burn it and see what happens." And so Gary dropped the white phosphorus on that hut. It burst into flames, and the moment that happened, all hell broke loose. And we began taking small arms fire from the hut. and took numerous direct hits in the transmission, which was directly behind my head, right above Gary's head. The rounds came in through that back window and hit the transmission, and all that hot fluid inside the transmission came spraying out and coated us with this scalding hot transmission fluid, and we were soaked in it. And we began firing and shooting and yelling at the Cobra that we're hit and we're taking fire, and Gary's unloading the M60 machine gun, and Mr. Whitten's yelling, we're hit, and we turned and headed south. We got back across the Vietnam border, and the Cobra had rolled in and done a lot of damage to the village, and he caught up with us, and we were flying maybe 300 feet in the air. I'm not sure what the altitude was, I don't remember, but I believe we were doing about 100 miles per hour, and the Cobra was flying right alongside of us, watching us. And we asked Mr. Whitten's, all the lights were flashing on the dash panel, on the instrument panel, and those are warning lights telling us that things are overheating and it wasn't going to fly much longer. We had a long way to go. We asked Mr. Whitten, said, could we possibly find a big bomb crater, because there were bomb craters all over. We find a big bomb crater, sit down beside it, and just wait for help, rather than take a chance on crashing. And Mr. Whitten said, no, we're going to fly it home. And so I turned to Gary and I said, Gary, I said, we need to dump these fragmentation grenades and this white phosphorus. We need to get that out of here. And when I turned over my right shoulder to look at him, there was just this blank stare in his face, like he knew this was it. And so he went ahead and dumped that. And there were several things that I needed to do as an observer. And one thing I needed to do in the event of a crash was to hit what was called the inertia lock. There were two switches between me and Mr. Whitten that I was to throw, and what those would do, we were in aircraft harnesses, and what that would do is lock us into position so that we would not move around and we couldn't be thrown out of the helicopter on impact. So I hit that inertia switch, and when I did, I remembered everything locked up in the helicopter. The transmission had locked up, and when it did, it killed the engine, and we lost RPMs. The rotor blades slowed way down. The rotor blades continue to spin so that you can do what is called an auto rotation. You can glide into the ground, but when you lose your RPMs, it comes down a lot faster than it should. And so that's what happened with us. And so we came down. I heard Mr. Whitten yelling, we're going down. And then I heard the Cobra yelling, calling for help. And we crashed into a clearing. And when we did, we skidded in very hard into a clearing. And when we hit the ground, I remember the helicopter flipped over on the left side. I remember the glass breaking in front of me, and that's as we hit the jungle, and that's the last thing I remember about the crash. I came to, and when I did, I was flat on my back, and I was looking up through the trees, and I felt like this is a bad dream. I was in total shock. I didn't know how badly I had been injured. And I kind of just rolled my head over to one side, and I could see what appeared to be like a bonfire burning, maybe about 50 feet away, and there was ammunition. There were tracer rounds shooting out of that bonfire. And I thought, I've got to find out where my crew is. And so somehow I got to my feet. And I tried to make my way over to the helicopter, but I couldn't walk. I didn't know what was wrong. And so I looked down at my feet, they wouldn't move, and my right foot was pointing backwards. My right thigh had been broken in 2 places. My pelvis had been broken in 3 places. And I was covered with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degree burns. My entire backside was covered with 1st degree burns. My right arm and other parts on my legs, my hips, and my abdomen were burned with third-degree burns. And so when I saw my foot turned around, I passed out and fell flat back again on my back. And I came to again, and when I came to this time, there were two medical corpsmen on the ground with me trying to get me onto a stretcher. And I grabbed one of them by the hand, by the wrist, and I said, I've got two crewmen down here. I said, you've got to find them. And so he went over to where the bonfire was, and at this point there was no longer any tracer rounds shooting out of it. And he went over and looked at that, and he came back and he looked at me and shook his head no. And I knew what he meant. They were gone. And when he shook his head no, I remember I just began to cry. Uncontrollably. I just couldn't stop crying. I knew I had lost my crew. And so they hoisted me out of the jungle, took me back to a rear area, and for several days I was in and out of consciousness, and they began sewing me back together and doing all kinds of things to me, doctors and nurses all around me. And after several days they began telling me how badly I was injured. I was in a body cast from my feet all the way to my chest. And they began telling me about the broken bones and the burns. And then within a week or so, I remember they asked me if I knew how this crash happened and how I got out of the helicopter. And so they sent in an investigation team, and they began to question me. And they asked me, how did you get out of the helicopter? Were you sitting in the back seat that day? And maybe Gary was in the front. And I said, no, I was in the front right alongside Mr. Whitten, the pilot. And they said, well, we can't figure out how you got out. Do you think you were thrown out? And I said, I couldn't have been thrown out. I said, I hit the inertia lock. And I said, if I had been thrown out, I wouldn't have been burned. And they said, well, that makes sense. He said, well, the reason we're questioning is because we found Mr. Whitten in the front seat right where he belonged, and we found Gary McKiddy in the front seat over the top of him with his arms wrapped around him. And they said, we can't figure out how you got out of that helicopter. And I said, I don't know. I was unconscious. We were in the jungle burning, and the Cobra couldn't see. We were underneath the jungle, and there was too much smoke and flames. And so I don't know how I got out, and nobody could see what was going on. And so the Army put together what they believed happened was that Gary McKiddy, sitting in the back seat on a bench seat with a lap belt, either got tossed or he jumped out. I expect he rode through the crash and he got out. And when he did, he got me out first, drugged me away, came back for the pilot, and the live ammunition and the explosion of the helicopter killed them both. That's what they put together, and they awarded Gary McKiddy the Silver Star based on that information. They would not award him the Medal of Honor because there were no live witnesses, no eyewitnesses. And we've tried for many years to get him the Medal of Honor, and all to no avail. I was sent back to the States. They took several weeks to stabilize me. I ended up at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver, Colorado. Put me in the orthopedic ward. I needed to be in the burn ward, so they did burn work on me while I was in the orthopedic ward because I had the numerous broken bones. They needed to put me in there. I believe it was a month or so in the hospital, and I received a phone call from Mr. McKiddy, Mr. Alfred McKiddy, Gary's dad. And Mr. McKiddy, I remember this very clearly, he was on the phone and he was crying. And all he could do was cry. And I remember he got one question to me, and that was this. He said, Jim, I just got to know, did my boy get a chance to pray before he died? And I said, yes, sir. Mr. McKiddy, you can be sure of that. And August of 1970, I went home on leave. Convalescent leave is what they called it. I got 3 weeks to go home. I was beginning to mend at this point, and so I got home, and my cousin had also just, in the Marine Corps, had just arrived home from Vietnam and lived in the St. Louis area, so I wanted to meet the McKiddy family, plus Gary was being awarded the Silver Star posthumously here in Miamisburg, and so we drove out here. I believe it was late August or early September that Gary was awarded the Silver Star, and so I came out for that event, and that's the first time that I met the McKiddy family, and I've been very close to them ever since. I spent a total of 12 months and 3 weeks in the hospital, going through numerous surgeries, skin grafts mostly. In Denver, Colorado is where I was the whole time. I didn't understand some things, about how, a young man like Gary McKiddy would die and read his Bible, and I wasn't interested in things like that, and he died and I lived. It just didn't make sense to me, and so I began to live a pretty crazy life. I was depressed, I was angry, started playing in rock bands and just living a crazy lifestyle. And in '73, I'm not even going to go into detail all the things that I did to just try to burn the memory of everything out of my mind, but I just couldn't deal with it, and I didn't want to talk about it. And when I went to college, I wouldn't even tell anybody that I was a Vietnam veteran. I didn't want people to know. With all the demonstrations that were going on college campuses, I hate to say it, but it was not a friendly environment for Vietnam veterans, I didn't think, and so I just kept my mouth shut. In 1975, my wife and her family, her uncle had been listening to this preacher on the radio, and so her whole family went to church. And she comes back and says, "Guess what?" She said, "I gave my life to Jesus." And I said, "Well, that's good for you. I'm really not interested in that." She says, "Well, would you please go with me?" He said, "I think it'd be good for you." I said, "No, I don't want to." And so for several weeks she asked me, and she didn't harp on me. She didn't, really preach at me, but I noticed a change in her. After several weeks of her asking me, I said, "Okay, I'll go with you." Sunday night, I remember, and had hair down to here. The McKiddy family can remember that. I had bell-bottom jeans on. I was pretty easy to spot as an oddball in a church service. At the end of the service, this evangelist asked for people if they'd like prayer for anything, and her whole family gets up and goes down there, and I didn't want to sit there by myself, so I went with them. So this guy is going from one person to the next and just praying for them and asking them what their prayer need was. This evangelist stops at me and asks me, "What can I pray with you about, young man?" And I said, I kind of hemmed and hawed a little bit. I said, "I've got a few scars, I'm a little beat up." And he said, this guy stops right then when I said that, and he looks at me right in the eye, and I remember he pointed his finger in my face. He said, "Young man," he said, "God has worked a great miracle in your life." And he says, "But his patience will only go so far." He said, "You need to come to Jesus right now and quit playing games with God." And when he said that, somehow I knew that God had spoken to him and revealed something to him about me. I didn't know how, I just knew that something had happened. Right there at that moment, I prayed and I recommitted my life to the Lord Jesus Christ. And I began attending church, and I began to pray, and I began to just devour the Bible. And as I began doing that, things began to change within me. Nobody told me I had to cut my hair. Nobody made me do that. Nobody ever said anything about it. but I began to clean up, and I began to feel good inside. And the depression and the anger and the bitterness began to leave. And I began to piece things together. Things started to make sense again. And as I was reading through the Bible, I came to this verse one day in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 13. Jesus is getting ready to die on the cross, and he's talking to his disciples. And this Bible verse says this: "No man has any greater love than this, than he would lay down his life for his friends." And when I read that Bible verse, it leapt out of the pages and hit me right between the eyes. It made such sense to me. I felt like that was my Bible verse. No greater love has any man than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends. And people began to see a huge change in my life. I remember calling the McKiddy family and talking to them and telling them what had happened, and they were just amazed that I received Jesus. I recommitted my life to him. And I can honestly say that it is the best decision I've ever made. And I'm going to see Gary McKiddy again someday. I look forward to that day. That day is coming again. And I'm so blessed to be involved with the McKiddy family. I love them like they're my own. And Mr. McKiddy is one of my favorite people of all time. He's like my dad now. My parents are both gone, and so they have been my family. And I love them all dearly. I pray for them all the time. And would still like to see Gary McKiddy awarded the Medal of Honor. I believe he deserves it. But that's all I can tell you about the story, guys. That's basically it. And so I share this story wherever I get the opportunity. I've shared it all across the country. I was invited to share this story with the 1st Cavalry Division in 1999 down at Fort Hood, Texas. And I went down there with the McKiddy family. And then I've been on the radio twice in St. Louis. I was on the news, Fox News up in Detroit. I've shared 2 times at the Traveling Wall, the Vietnam Wall, once right in Miamisburg, once in Troy, Illinois, where I live. And so wherever I can share this story, I do.